Riley Mercer chewed the inside of her cheek until she tasted copper, just to stay awake through day 3 of the standoff. 3,000 yards out, crosswinds tearing through the valley like a freight train. When Commander Keller's voice scraped over the comms, telling her to pack it in, that the math was dead and no one could make that shot, she didn't argue. She just settled her cheek against the stock, exhaled slowly, and pulled the trigger. Grit coated the roof of her mouth. Every time she swallowed, it felt like grinding cheap sandpaper against her tonsils. They had been wedged into this limestone crevice for 72 hours. 72 hours of breathing in Hayes's stagnant body odor and her own sour, ammonia-laced sweat. The jagged rock pressing into her lower ribs had stopped feeling like an external object sometime around dawn of the second day. It had simply become a part of her anatomy, a permanent, deep-tissue ache that pulsed in time with her resting heart rate. Her lips were cracked, peeling in dry strips that she occasionally bit off and spat into the dust. She was supposed to be a Tier 1 operator, the tip of the spear. Right now, she felt like a piece of spoiled meat left out to cure on a high-altitude frying pan. "Winds shifting again," Hayes murmured. His voice was barely a rasp, dried out from rationing water. He didn't turn his head from the spotting scope. He just lay there, a dust-covered lump of camouflage netting and suppressed misery. "I see it," Riley whispered back. Her vocal cords felt tight, glued together. She blinked, fighting the heavy, narcotic pull of exhaustion. Her eyelids felt like they were lined with lead. She shifted her right shoulder exactly 2 millimeters to relieve a pinch in her trapezius muscle. Any more movement, and they risked compromising the hide. Any less, and her arm would go entirely numb. Down in the valley below, the world was a baked expanse of cracked earth and skeletal scrub brush. 3,250 yards away sat a concrete compound. It looked like a discarded child's toy from this elevation. Heat mirages rippled off the valley floor, distorting the air into a shimmering, watery soup that made the concrete walls down there dance and warp in her rifle's optic. This was the glamorous reality of the job. She didn't feel heroic when she was pissing into a plastic pouch while lying on her side, trying not to splash her own boots. She didn't feel brave when her primary thought for 6 hours straight was a desperate, pathetic craving for a cold can of generic soda. She just felt empty. She had become a machine made of cramped muscles and calculating reticles. Static popped in her right ear, sharp and synthetic. "Romeo 2, this is actual. Radio check. Give me a status." Commander Keller. Sitting in an air-conditioned command tent 200 miles away, probably drinking coffee that actually tasted like coffee and not iodine tablets. Riley keyed the mic on her chest rig. "Actual Romeo 2. Solid copy. No change at the objective. We're baking rocks up here." "Copy that, Romeo 2. Intel says the meet is still happening. Window is closing. If they don't show by sundown, we scrub." She released the mic and closed her eyes for 3 seconds, letting the cool dark behind her eyelids soothe the burning in her retinas. Scrubbing meant hiking 12 miles out in the dark, carrying 90 pounds of gear, with nothing to show for it but blistered heels and a sunburn. It meant these 3 ghosts, Generals Briggs, Whitmore, and Croft, would scatter back into the wind, taking their private mercenary army and their dirty war with them. "They'll show," Hayes rasped quietly, his eyes still glued to the glass. "Briggs is too arrogant to miss a summit he called himself." Riley adjusted her cheek weld against the synthetic stock of the rifle. The metal of the bolt was hot enough to brand skin, heated by the relentless afternoon sun baking through their netting. She ran her index finger along the trigger guard. Smooth. Familiar. They waited. The sun began its slow, agonizing crawl toward the western ridge. The shadows stretched out like long, dark fingers across the valley floor. The temperature, which had been boiling an hour ago, was already starting to plummet. The sweat trapped beneath her plate carrier turned clammy, sending a shiver down her spine that she forced herself to suppress. Shivering ruins aim. Shivering means losing control. Movement, Hayes said. The word was flat, stripped of all adrenaline. It was just a data point. She opened her left eye, keeping her right firmly locked in the optic. Down in the compound, a heavy steel door was sliding open on its track. "I have eyes," she breathed. Her heart didn't race. It didn't pound like it does in the movies. It just settled into a low, steady rhythm. Thump, thump, thump. Her body knew what was coming before her brain fully acknowledged it. 3 armored SUVs rolled out from the subterranean garage, their suspensions heavy. Tires kicking up slow, lazy clouds of pulverized dust. They parked in the center of the courtyard in a tight triangle. "Vehicle 1, door opening," Hayes called out, his tone shifting into the rhythmic, detached cadence of a spotter feeding raw data. "Target 1 identified. It's Briggs. Grey hair, heavy build, tan uniform." She found him in the crosshairs. He stepped out of the vehicle, adjusting a pistol belt on his hip. Through the high-powered glass, he didn't look like a warlord responsible for mass graves. He looked like an annoyed middle manager checking his watch. "Target 2, Whitmore, exiting vehicle 2, tall, bald, black vest over green shirt." Riley tracked right. Whitmore was stretching his back, hands on his hips. "Target 3, Hayes continued. "Croft, vehicle 3, he's got the satellite phone." Croft stepped out, already yelling at someone inside the SUV. 3 rogue generals, 3 men who had orchestrated a bloody coup, destabilized an entire region, and cost her 2 teammates 3 years ago. Looking at them, she didn't feel rage. She just felt a cold, hard knot form in the pit of her stomach. She chambered around. The heavy brass casing of the .416 caliber bullet slid into the breech. She locked the bolt down. The metallic click was swallowed entirely by the wind, howling across the mountain face. "Actual Romeo 2, she transmitted. "Jackpot. I have all 3 primary targets in the open." There was a long pause on the radio. Then Keller's voice returned, but the pitch was wrong. It was too fast, too tense. "Romeo 2, hold your fire. I repeat, hold your fire. Weather data just updated. We are looking at a freak pressure system moving into your valley. What's your wind looking like?" She glanced at Hayes. He was already checking the Kestrel meter, frowning. "Wind is bad," Hayes said to her, not bothering to key the mic. "We've got a baseline of 14 knots, gusting to 22. But it's bouncing, swirling off the western ridge. Actual," Riley said into the mic. "Wind is erratic, 14 to 22 knots, variable." "Romeo 2, abort," Keller's voice snapped over the comms. "Our models are showing 3 distinct thermal layers between your elevation and the valley floor. The crosswinds are opposing. You are shooting through a blender, Mercer. The math is dead. No one can make that shot at that distance with these conditions. Stand down." Riley stared through the scope. Briggs was lighting a cigar. Whitmore was pointing at a map spread across the hood of the SUV. Croft was still yelling into his phone. They were completely exposed, arrogant in their isolation. They believed the distance kept them safe. They believed the mountain protected them. "He's right, Riley," Hayes whispered. He was looking at his ballistic calculator. His dirty, cracked finger tapped the screen. "It's 3,250 yards. Flight time is over 4 seconds. The bullet has to pass through a cold thermal drop over the ravine, hit a wall of hot air rising off the valley floor, and then navigate a left-to-right crosswind that is currently fighting a right-to-left gust coming off the compound walls. It's a lottery ticket. She listened to Hayes. She listened to the wind tearing at their camouflage netting. She felt the cold seeping into her joints. She thought about the 72 hours of eating dust, of smelling her own rot, of holding perfectly still until her muscles screamed. She wasn't going to hike down this mountain with unfired brass. "Actual," she said, her voice dropping to a gravelly deadpan. "I have a green light on target identification. I am holding position. Mercer, this is a direct order. Abort. You take a shot and miss. You scatter them. We lose them forever. The risk profile is too high. No one can make that shot." Keller's words hung in her ear. No one can make that shot. It wasn't a challenge. It wasn't some cinematic moment where she grinned and decided to prove him wrong. She didn't care about Keller's ego or her own pride. She cared about the geometry of violence. She cared about the cold, unyielding physics of a heavy bullet cutting through chaotic air. And more than anything, she was just so profoundly tired of these three men existing in the world. "Hayes," she said, keeping her eye in the optic. "Give me a read." Hayes hesitated. She could hear his breathing stutter. He was a good spotter, the best. He respected the math above all else, and right now the math was telling him to pack up and go home. "Riley, read the wind, Hayes, give me the hold." He let out a long, ragged sigh. She heard the rustle of him shifting his weight back into the spotting scope. "Fine. Target 1. Briggs," Hayes muttered, his voice dropping back into that flat, machine-like cadence. "Distance 3250. Elevation. Hold high. You're going to need 94 MOA up." Riley dialed the turret on her scope. The clicks were tactile, precise, snapping into place under her stiff fingers. "Wind," Hayes continued, his voice tightening. "It's a mess. Call it 18 knots right to left at the objective, but you've got a left-to-right thermal shear at the halfway mark. Hold left, 4.5 mils. She shifted the rifle. Briggs's head moved out of the center of her crosshairs, migrating to the bottom right quadrant of her vision. She wasn't even aiming at him anymore. She was aiming at a patch of empty, shimmering air 50 feet to his left and 20 feet above his head. It felt completely counterintuitive. It felt like madness. "Mercer," Keller barked in her ear, "acknowledge the abort order." She reached up with her left hand and clicked the radio off. The sudden silence in her headset was deafening, just the wind whistling through the rocks. "Radio is off," she told Hayes quietly. "We're committed." "If you miss this, we're both going to Leavenworth," he replied. "I'll take the top bunk." Riley settled in. The world shrank. The periphery of her vision darkened, tunneling down until there was nothing left but the reticle and the tiny, distant figure of General Briggs smoking his cigar. She focused on her breathing. In through the nose, drawing the dry, dusty air deep into her diaphragm. Out through the mouth. The crosshairs floated in a slow, rhythmic figure. 8, perfectly in time with her heartbeat. She needed to break the shot in the valley between heartbeats. "Wind is spiking," Hayes whispered. "Hold left 5 mils. Send it on your command." She held the crosshairs on the empty air. She didn't look at Briggs. If a shooter looks at the target, they pull toward the target. She had to trust the math. She had to trust the empty space. Her finger applied pressure to the trigger. The wall, the brake. The rifle violently punched her in the shoulder. A concussive shockwave ripped dust off the rocks around them. The muzzle brake blasted a V-shaped wave of dirt into the air, instantly obscuring her vision. She immediately worked the bolt. Up, back. The the spent brass casing ejected, flying through the air and landing directly on her exposed forearm. It was scalding hot, searing into her skin. She didn't flinch. She pushed the bolt forward, chambering the second round, and drove her eye back into the scope. Flight time, Hayes was counting softly. 2, 3, 4. Through the optic, the world was still normal down in the compound. Briggs was still holding his cigar. Time stretched, elastic and agonizing. 4.5 seconds is an eternity in a rifle scope. Impact. In the scope, Briggs's head suddenly ceased to exist in its previous form. There was no theatrical flying backward. He simply crumpled. He dropped straight down like a marionette, with its strings brutally severed. A faint pink mist drifted lazily in the wind where he had been standing. "Target 1 down," Hayes said. There was no celebration, just cold efficiency. "Target 2, Whitmore. He's reacting, looking down." Whitmore was freezing in place, staring at the collapsed form of his colleague. He hadn't heard the gunshot yet. The bullet travels faster than sound. Down there, it was still silent. "Wind is dropping," Hayes snapped. "Thermal shift. Hold left 3 mils. Elevation is the same. He's static." Riley shifted the rifle, putting the crosshairs onto empty space again. She exhaled. The natural respiratory pause. The gap between beats. She pulled the trigger. The recoil kicked her back. Bolt up, back, forward. Another hot casing hit the dirt. She drove back into the glass. Down in the compound, the sound of the first shot finally arrived. Panic erupted. Whitmore looked up toward the mountains, his mouth open in a shout she couldn't hear. Guards were scrambling, lifting rifles. 3, 4, Hayes counted. Whitmore pivoted, taking exactly 1 step toward the SUV door. Impact. The heavy point, .416 round, caught him just behind the right ear. His body whipped violently to the side, slamming against the armored door of the vehicle before sliding down to the dust, leaving a thick, dark smear on the green paint. "Target 2 down." Hayes's voice was tighter now. The adrenaline was bleeding through his professional facade. "Target 3. Croft. He's running." Croft was smart. He wasn't freezing. He was sprinting in a zigzag pattern toward the subterranean garage, his head tucked down. "Moving target," Hayes called out, his voice rising in pitch. "Distance decreasing slightly. Call it 3240. Wind is whipping back up. Right to left. Hold right. Hold right 2 mils. Lead him. Lead him 4 mils left." Riley tracked Croft. This wasn't math anymore. This was instinct. Shooting a running target at nearly 2 miles through crosswinds wasn't a calculation. It was a feeling. It was knowing the rhythm of a man's stride. He was 60 yards from the garage door. She led the crosshairs ahead of his sprinting form, past his body, into the empty, sun-baked concrete, where he would be in 4 seconds. "Send it," Hayes hissed. She squeezed. The rifle roared. The punch to her shoulder felt like a sledgehammer. Bolt back. Chamber empty. She didn't load another round. She just watched through the settling dust. Croft was 50 yards from the door. 40 yards. He was moving fast, fueled by raw terror. 3, Hayes counted. 4. Croft was 10 yards from the shadow of the garage. He looked like he was going to make it. He was going to dive into the concrete bunker, and they would lose him. Impact. The bullet struck him at the base of the skull, right where the neck meets the spine. His forward momentum carried his body tumbling end over end across the concrete, a violent ragdoll collision of limbs and gear. He slid to a halt just inches from the dark threshold of the garage. He didn't move. None of them did. The courtyard was suddenly, deathly still, save for the panicked guards taking cover behind the SUVs. aiming their weapons blindly at the surrounding mountains. They had no idea where death had come from. Hayes let out a breath that sounded like a tire deflating. He slowly pushed himself back from the spotting scope. "Target 3 down," he whispered. He turned his head and looked at her. His face was caked in dirt, his eyes wide and bloodshot against the pale skin where his goggles usually sat. 3 for 3? You actually did it." Riley didn't answer right away. She slowly lifted her head off the stock. Her neck was screaming in agony. Her right arm was trembling slightly from the repeated recoil and the massive dump of adrenaline that was finally washing out of her system. The burn on her forearm from the hot brass was starting to throb with a sharp, stinging pain. She reached up and clicked the radio back on. "Actual Romeo 2, she said. Her voice was rough, cracking at the edges. Static hissed for a moment. Then Keller's voice came through. It wasn't angry. It wasn't commanding. It sounded hollow, shocked. "Romeo 2, I gave you an abort order." "Copy that, Actual," she replied, looking down at the 3 distant, motionless shapes in the dirt. She tasted the copper in her mouth again, swallowing the grit. "Must have been a comms malfunction. Sunspots." There was a long silence on the net. "Targets are down," Keller asked quietly. "Jackpot complete," she said. 3 primary targets neutralized. Requesting exfil coordinates. Coordinates. Coordinates are being sent to your terminal now, Romeo 2. Good. Good shooting." She clicked the radio off. She didn't feel victorious. She didn't feel like a hero. She felt dirty, exhausted, and desperately thirsty. She looked at Hayes, who was already starting to pack up the spotting gear, his hands shaking slightly. "Come on," she said, her voice flat. "Let's get off this damn rock." Gravel crunched under their boots, sounding as loud as artillery fire in the thinning air. They had 12 miles of hostile, near-vertical terrain between their hide and the extraction point. 12 miles with 90 pounds of gear strapped to backs that had been curled into fetal positions for 3 days. "Comms are dark," Hayes muttered, securing the spotting scope into his pack. He didn't look at her. He was moving with the stiff, jerky motions of a man operating entirely on fumes and adrenaline withdrawal. "I disabled the GPS transponder. Keller can wait until we're on the bird to yell at us." "Good," Riley grunted, hoisting her pack. The straps bit immediately into the raw sores on her collarbones. She tightened the sternum strap, forcing the weight higher. It didn't help. It just changed the location of the agony. They began the descent. Night fell not with a slow fade, but like a heavy woolen blanket dropped over the mountains. The temperature crashed into the low 30s. Sweat that had soaked her base layers during the afternoon sun now turned into a layer of icy sludge against her ribs. She shivered, a violent, involuntary spasm that rattled her teeth. She flipped down her night vision goggles. The world snapped into a grainy, 2-dimensional sea of phosphor green. Depth perception vanished. Every shadow looked like a canyon. Every rock looked like a tripping hazard. "Step," she whispered, sliding her left boot down a slick patch of scree. They moved in absolute silence for the first 3 hours. The only sounds were the ragged, forced pulls of air through their noses and the occasional squeak of nylon webbing under tension. Her knees took the brunt of the abuse. Every downward step was a shockwave, travelling up her shin, grinding the patella against the joint. By mile 5, her left knee wasn't a joint anymore. It was a rusty hinge filled with crushed glass. Down in the valley, a mile below their current elevation, headlights cut through the darkness. Small, frantic beams sweeping the desert floor. The compound was buzzing like a kicked hornet's nest. They were searching for ghosts. They would never look this high up. They couldn't fathom that death had reached out from 3,000 yards. "They're panicking," Hayes breathed during a brief halt. He was leaning forward against a massive boulder, trying to take the weight off his spine without actually sitting down. If a hiker sits down on mile 6, they don't get back up. "Let them," Riley said. She reached for her hydration bladder tube, biting the valve. A few drops of warm, plastic-tasting water hit her cracked tongue, then nothing. Dry. She spat out a clump of grit. "Save your breath. We've got a ridge to clear." Mile 9 broke her. Not mentally, but mechanically. The blister on her right heel, which had been building for the last 2 days, finally sheared open. She felt the skin tear away from the raw flesh underneath, followed by a hot rush of blood pooling in her sock. She didn't stop. She just adjusted her gait, limping slightly, favoring the outside edge of her boot. Pain is just data. A soldier can choose to ignore data if it doesn't serve the mission. The extraction zone was a flat plateau of hard-packed dirt surrounded by razor-backed ridges. They hit it at 0300 hours. The wind was howling again, throwing sand into their faces. They knelt in the dirt, forming a tight 360-degree perimeter, rifles up, scanning the green-tinted darkness. Her arms were trembling so violently she could barely hold the stock steady. The adrenaline was entirely gone, replaced by a nauseating, hollow exhaustion that made her vision swim. A low, rhythmic thumping vibrated through the ground before she heard it. Then, the distinct chop of a Blackhawk's rotors chewing through the thin mountain air. It came in dark, no running lights, a massive black shape blotting out the stars. It didn't touch down. The pilots held it in a low hover, wheels 2 feet off the deck, kicking up a blinding maelstrom of dust and loose shale. Hayes moved first, sprinting under the rotor wash and diving into the open side door. Riley followed, grabbing the lip of the deck and hauling herself up. Her torn heel screamed, but the crew chief grabbed the drag handle on the back of her plate carrier and yanked her inside like a sack of wet cement. She collapsed onto the aluminum floor. The cabin smelled strongly of JP-8 jet fuel, hydraulic fluid, and old sweat. It was the most beautiful scent in the world. The bird banked hard, climbing out of the valley. Riley rolled onto her back, staring up at the red interior crew light. Hayes was slumped against the opposite wall, his head thrown back, eyes closed. He looked like a corpse. She probably looked worse. She didn't feel the rush of victory. She just felt the vibration of the deck plates rattling against her skull and the slow, heavy thud of her own heart, trying to convince itself that the work was done. Fluorescent lights are an assault. After 72 hours of squinting through scope glare and navigating by starlight, the harsh, humming white tubes in the Tactical Operations Center felt like physical blows to her retinas. Riley stood at parade rest, though her posture was more of a controlled slump. Her boots left dirty, bloody smears on the pristine linoleum floor. She smelled like dried urine, cordite, and necrotic skin. Commander Keller sat behind a metal folding table. He was wearing a perfectly pressed uniform. His boots were shined. His hair was neat. He looked at a tablet screen, his jaw clenched so tight the muscle fluttered near his ear. He didn't look up at them for a full 2 minutes. It was a power play, a cheap, administrative attempt to assert dominance over 2 operators who had just rewritten the ballistic physics manual. She stared at a coffee stain on the wall behind his left shoulder. She tracked the jagged edges of it, forcing her mind to stay awake. If she closed her eyes, she knew she would fall backward. 3,250 yards, Keller finally said. His voice was dangerously soft. He set the tablet face down on the metal table with a sharp clack. Through variable crosswinds, through an opposing thermal shear. "Yes, sir," she rasped. Her throat felt like it was coated in ash. Keller stood up. He walked around the table, stopping 3 feet in front of her. He crossed his arms. "I gave you a direct order to abort, Chief Mercer." "Comms were heavily degraded by the storm front, sir," Riley lied. Her voice didn't waver. She kept her eyes locked on the wall behind him. "We experienced intermittent static. The abort order was not clearly received prior to the engagement sequence." Keller scoffed, a harsh, humorless sound. "Don't insult my intelligence, Riley. The comms logs show a solid connection. You clicked your radio off." "Equipment malfunctions in austere environments, sir." He stepped closer. She could smell his aftershave. It smelled like fake cedar and rubbing alcohol. It made her want to throw up. "You defied a direct command from a superior officer. You risked compromising a classified theater of operations. If you had missed, Briggs and his little junta would have scattered to the winds, and the geopolitical fallout would have landed squarely on my desk." "But I didn't miss, sir," she said quietly. Keller stopped. He stared at her, his eyes searching her face for a smirk, for arrogance. He found nothing. She was too tired for arrogance. "No," Keller said, his voice dropping. "You didn't. Drone BDA confirms 3 targets neutralized. Kinetic strikes to the cranium for all 3. The compound is in absolute chaos. They think they were hit by a guided missile." He walked back around his desk and leaned heavily against it. The anger was draining out of him, replaced by a begrudging, terrifying realization. He couldn't court-martial her. Command doesn't court-martial the sniper who just executed the most impossible, high-value assassination of the decade. They pin a medal on them in secret and sweep the insubordination under the rug. "You got lucky, Mercer. Math isn't luck, sir." Hayes spoke up for the first time. His voice was hoarse but steady. "It was a calculated ballistic trajectory. Chief Mercer executed perfectly." Keller shot Hayes a withering glare. "Shut up, Hayes. You're just as culpable." He turned his attention back to Riley. "You think you're a hero because you pulled off a parlor trick?" "No, sir." "Good. Because you're a liability, a rogue element. I can't trust you." Keller picked up his tablet again, swiping violently at the screen. "You are confined to your quarters until the transport bird arrives tomorrow morning. You are both standing down. I want your weapons logged with the armorer, and I want your after-action report filed by 0800. "Yes, sir." Keller didn't dismiss them. He just stopped looking at them. They were ghosts again. Riley executed a slow, agonizing about-face. Her knee popped audibly in the quiet room. She walked out of the TOC, Hayes right behind her. The heavy metal door clicked shut, cutting off the chill of the air conditioning. The heat of the forward operating base hit her like a physical wall. Generators hummed in the distance, a constant, low-frequency vibration that rattled her teeth. "He's going to bury us in paperwork," Hayes muttered as they walked towards the armory hut. "Let him," she said. "Paperwork doesn't bleed." They handed their rifles over to a bewildered armor technician who stared at the pulverized dust caked into the optics and the heavy scratches on the carbon fiber barrels. Riley didn't feel a sense of relief handing the weapon over. She felt a sudden, sharp vulnerability. Her hands felt empty. Walking to the CHU, the containerized housing unit, took 15 minutes. It felt longer than the 12-mile hike. Her body was rapidly realizing that the threat was over, and the adrenaline system was shutting down entirely. Her vision blurred. Her breathing became shallow. She opened the heavy metal door to her quarters. The room was 6 feet wide and 10 feet long. A metal cot, a plastic locker, a single, tiny window covered by blackout curtains. She didn't turn on the light. She just stood in the dark, listening to the harsh, rattling sound of her own lungs. Water in the FOB showers wasn't really water. It was a harsh, chemically treated liquid that smelled heavily of chlorine and copper piping. It hissed out of the showerhead in a weak, sputtering stream. Riley stood under it, fully clothed in her base layers, watching the water turn a dark, muddy brown as it pooled around the drain. The dirt of the mountain was washing away, but the exhaustion felt permanently tattooed onto her bones. She peeled the soaked shirt over her head. The fabric caught on the blistered burn on her forearm, tearing the skin further. She hissed, a sharp intake of breath, and examined the wound under the flickering fluorescent bulb. It was an ugly, angry red oval, the exact dimensions of a spent .416 casing. A permanent brand. She peeled off her socks. The right one was glued to her heel with dried blood. She had to bite down on a rolled-up washcloth to keep from screaming as she ripped the nylon fabric away from the raw flesh. She poured a bottle of iodine directly onto the wound. The pain was blinding, a brilliant white flash behind her eyes. She leaned her forehead against the cold, damp cinder-block wall and waited for the nausea to pass. 20 minutes later, she was lying on the thin mattress of her cot. She was wearing clean cotton shorts and a t-shirt, but her skin still crawled. She stared at the ceiling panels. The air conditioner in the corner rattled, a rhythmic clack, clack, clack that sounded terrifyingly like a kestrel wind meter spinning in a crosswind. She closed her eyes. Instantly, the darkness was replaced by the green-tinted scope ring. 3,250 yards. She saw Briggs crumble. She saw the pink mist. She saw Whitmore slam against the armored door. She saw Croft tumbling across the concrete, his legs tangling in a grotesque display of broken physics. Her eyes snapped open. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, trapped in a cage of anxiety. She wasn't there. She was in a metal box. They were dead, but her body didn't believe it. Her muscles were still tight, waiting for the recoil. Her finger twitched against the coarse blanket, searching for the trigger wall. A soldier doesn't just turn off the predator instinct. They don't spend 72 hours hunting human beings and then seamlessly transition back to a normal resting heart rate. The violence stays in the blood. It alters the chemistry of the brain. A sharp knock on the metal door made her flinch. She sat up, instantly awake, her hand instinctively reaching for the pistol she no longer had strapped to her hip. "Yeah," she croaked. The door creaked open. Hayes stood in the hallway frame, cast in the jaundiced yellow light of the compound. He wasn't wearing his uniform shirt, just a green t-shirt and uniform pants. He was holding 2 dented aluminum mugs and an unlabeled glass bottle filled with amber liquid. He stepped inside and kicked the door shut with his heel. "Command Master Chief's private stash," Hayes said, his voice flat. He walked over and set the mugs on the small plastic folding table. He uncorked the bottle with his teeth and poured a generous 3 fingers into each cup. "Don't ask how I got it." Riley swung her legs over the edge of the cot, wincing as her torn heel touched the floor. She picked up a mug. The smell of cheap bourbon burned her nostrils. "To insubordination," Hayes said softly, raising his cup. "To math," she countered. They drank. The liquor was liquid fire. It tasted like wood rot and regret, but it hit the stomach with a heavy, spreading warmth that temporarily chased away the bone-deep chill of the mountain. Hayes sat on the edge of the small metal desk, staring at the floor. He rolled the empty mug between his palms. "Keller is right, you know," Hayes said quietly. The silence between them felt heavy, loaded with unsaid things. "About what?" "We should have aborted." He looked up at her. His eyes were dark, shadowed by exhaustion and something else. Doubt. I ran the calculation again on my tablet while I was in the armory, without the adrenaline, without the pressure. She stared at him. The bourbon burned in her throat. And it shouldn't have worked, Riley, Hayes whispered, leaning forward. The thermal drop over the ravine was a blind variable. The opposing winds, the sheer stress on the projectile in flight. The margin of error wasn't in inches, it was in feet. You didn't just calculate that shot, you guessed. She set her mug down on the table. The sharp clink sounded loud in the small room. I felt the wind, Hayes. I felt the gap. You can't feel an opposing thermal current at 2 miles, Hayes shot back, his voice rising, cracking slightly. He ran a hand over his shaved head. You took a gamble. With our careers, with the entire geopolitical stability of the sector. They're dead, she said coldly. Briggs isn't going to fund any more death squads. Whitmore isn't going to traffic any more weapons. The gamble paid off. Hayes shook his head slowly. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It looked like a printed tear sheet from a signals intelligence terminal. That's the thing about killing generals, Riley, he said, holding the paper out to her. They usually have bosses. She didn't take the paper. She just looked at his hand. It was trembling again. What is that? She asked. You remember Croft was on a satellite phone right before you dropped him? Yeah, he was yelling at someone. Intel boys pulled the raw feed off the NSA satellite dragnet, Hayes said. He dropped the paper onto her cot. Croft wasn't giving orders, Riley. He was receiving them. He was panicking, trying to explain why the shipment was delayed. She looked down at the paper. It was a partial transcript, translated from Russian. Who was he talking to? She asked, though a cold dread was already starting to pool in her stomach, replacing the warmth of the bourbon. A man named Volkov, Hayes said quietly. The architect of the entire coup. Briggs and his boys weren't the mastermind. They were just the middle management. And Volkov? Hayes swallowed hard. The transcript says Volkov has a team moving on the extraction point. They were tracking Croft's sat phone. Riley froze. The extraction point. Our extraction point. No, Hayes corrected, his eyes locking onto hers. The FOB here. They tracked the flight path of the Black Hawk that picked us up. The low hum of the base generators suddenly seemed to shift pitch. The silence of the night felt thick, suffocating. The math hadn't solved the problem. It had just kicked a much larger, much more dangerous hornet's nest. And they had just handed their rifles to the armorer. Generators don't just stop, they spool down. The constant low-frequency hum that had vibrated in her molars since they arrived suddenly pitched downward into a mechanical groan, followed by a violent, shuddering clunk. Then the FOB went pitch black. The air conditioner above her cot died with a rattling gasp. The silence that rushed into the small metal room was absolute and suffocating. It lasted exactly 3 seconds. A sharp, distinct crump echoed from the northern perimeter. Not a gunshot, indirect fire, mortars. They're walking them in, Hayes said. The bourbon glass slipped from his fingers, shattering on the cheap linoleum floor. The smell of alcohol instantly filled the cramped space, sharp and sterile. Riley's body reacted before her brain fully processed the tactical reality. She was off the cot, ignoring the white-hot spike of agony shooting up her leg as her raw right heel struck the cold floor. She dropped to her stomach, sliding under the metal frame of the bed. Dust coated her tongue. "Get down!" she hissed. Hayes hit the deck just as the second mortar landed. This one was closer. The shockwave punched the side of their containerized housing unit, bowing the corrugated metal inward with a deafening metallic shriek. Dust rained down from the ceiling panels, coating her sweaty skin in a fine layer of grit. "They hit the motor pool," Hayes coughed, spitting dust. He was scrambling in the dark, his hands patting the floor frantically. "They took out the generators first. This is a coordinated assault, Tier 1 tactics." "Volkov," she whispered. They were sitting in a tin can wearing gym clothes. Her primary weapon was locked in an armory 300 yards away. Her sidearm was with it. She had a folding bench-made knife in the pocket of her uniform pants, which were currently crumpled in the corner of the room. Riley low-crawled out from under the cot, her elbows scraping against the grit-covered floor. She found the pants in the dark by smell, ammonia and dried sweat. She fumbled in the cargo pocket, her fingers brushing the cold, textured G10 grip of the knife. She pulled it out, flicking the blade open with her thumb. The soft metallic snick was pathetic compared to the rolling thunder of the mortar barrage outside. "Riley," Hayes said. His voice was trembling in the dark, not from fear, but from the terrifying realization of their vulnerability. "We have no plates, no comms, no nods. We move," she said, keeping her voice dead flat. Panic is a contagion. If she let it into her vocal cords, they would both freeze and die in this box. "We get to the armory, we get our guns, we push to the TOC. The armory is on the other side of the mess hall. We have to cross the open yard. Then we run fast." She grabbed her boots. She didn't bother with socks. She shoved her bare, blistered feet into the stiff leather. The friction against her torn heel made her vision swim with black spots. She bit down on her lip until she tasted copper, forcing the pain into a tight, manageable box in the back of her mind. She stood up, gripping the knife. She pressed her back against the metal wall beside the door. Hayes mirrored her on the other side. He had nothing in his hands. He just held his fists clenched tight against his thighs. "On 3, she breathed. Outside, the distinct, rapid-fire chatter of an AK-74 broke through the heavy thud of the mortars. Then another. Then the heavier, slower rhythm of a PKM machine gun. They were already inside the wire. 1, 2, 3. She pushed the heavy handle down and kicked the door outward. Smoke rolled through the alleyways between the CHUs like a thick, grey river. It smelled of burning diesel, scorched earth, and the distinct, sulphurous tang of high explosives. The yellow perimeter lights were dead, but the base was illuminated by the strobing flashes of muzzle fire and the deep orange glow of a burning Humvee near the northern gate. Riley moved low, keeping her profile tight against the corrugated metal walls. Hayes was a shadow pinned to her 6 o'clock. Green tracer rounds floated lazily through the air overhead, moving with deceptive slowness before snapping past with a vicious, supersonic crack. The FOB was in absolute chaos. Support clerks in T-shirts and shorts were running blindly through the smoke, screaming for medics. The quick reaction force was trying to form a line near the mess hall, their M4s barking in short, undisciplined bursts into the dark. "Keep right," she muttered, sliding past a stack of wooden pallets. "Follow the HESCO barriers to the armory." They hit the open yard, a 50-yard expanse of hard-packed dirt between the housing units and the logistics hub. "Go," she snapped. She sprinted. Every time her right foot hit the dirt, the torn skin on her heel ripped a little further, sending a fresh wave of nausea through her stomach. She ignored it. A person can run on broken bones if the alternative is a bullet in the spine. They were halfway across when a figure materialized from the smoke to their left. He was big, wearing heavy plate armor and a fast helmet equipped with quad-tube night vision goggles. He wasn't one of theirs. He held a suppressed carbine tight to his shoulder, sweeping the yard. He saw them. The green glow of his NVGs locked onto her movement. He didn't yell. He didn't issue a challenge. He just pivoted the muzzle of his rifle toward her chest. She didn't have time to stop, to change direction, or to think. She threw her body weight forward, diving into the dirt just as a suppressed 3-round burst cut the air exactly where her torso had been a fraction of a second before. The bullets slammed into the dirt, kicking sand into her eyes. She rolled, pushing off her left leg, and launched herself at his knees. It was an ugly, desperate collision. They crashed to the ground in a tangle of limbs and tactical gear. He was heavy, smelling of stale tobacco and gun oil. He grunted, dropping his rifle to draw a sidearm. She didn't try to wrestle him. She drove her left forearm into his throat, pinning his head back against the dirt, and drove the Benchmade knife upward, aiming for the soft gap just beneath the edge of his body armor, right below the armpit. The blade sank in. It didn't glide like in the movies. It caught on heavy fabric, scraped against a rib, and required a violent, twisting shove to penetrate deep. Hot, slick blood instantly coated her hand. He thrashed violently. His knee drove upward, slamming into her ribs with the force of a sledgehammer. The breath exploded from her lungs. She tasted bile. He gurgled, his hands scrabbling uselessly at her wrist, his strength fading fast as the blade severed the brachial artery. She twisted the knife one more time, then ripped it out. He stopped moving, his eyes wide behind the green glow of the goggles. She rolled off him, gasping for air, clutching her ribs. Her hands were trembling violently, coated in thick, dark blood. The adrenaline was back, dumping into her system in toxic quantities, making her heart race so fast it felt like a continuous flutter in her chest. "Riley!" Hayes grabbed her shoulder, dragging her to her feet. "Move! More are coming." She didn't look back at the dead man. She wiped her bloody hand on her shorts and gripped the knife tighter. They hit the door of the armory a minute later. It was heavy reinforced steel, but it was standing wide open. The electronic keypad access had been bypassed when the power cut out. Inside it was dark, illuminated only by the faint red glow of a battery backup light in the corner. The air smelled of solvent and raw iron. "Miller," she called out softly. A wet, ragged cough answered from behind the metal-caged counter. They vaulted the counter. Miller, the young armor technician, was slumped against the weapons racks. His chest was soaked in blood, 2 bullet holes in his plate carrier. He was breathing in shallow, bubbling gasps. They took the heavy ordnance," Miller choked out, his eyes glassy, failing to focus on her face. "A T-4s, breaching charges, headed for the TOC. Shh," she said, pressing her hand over the wounds, though they both knew it was entirely useless. "Hold still, Miller." Just get your guns," he whispered, his head lolling to the side. "Rack 4. He exhaled a long, shivering breath, and didn't inhale again. She stared at his lifeless face for a second. The anger, cold and sharp, pushed the fear out of her chest. She stood up. "Rack 4, she told Hayes. They found their Pelican cases. She popped the heavy latches. Her .416 sniper rifle lay inside, broken down into its upper and lower receivers. The familiar smell of the synthetic stock grounded her. It was a tool of precision in a world that had suddenly descended into chaotic, intimate violence. "Sidearms first," Hayes said, tossing her a SIG M17 from a nearby rack, along with 3 loaded magazines. She slapped a magazine into the pistol, racked the slide, and holstered it in the waistband of her shorts. The metal was freezing against her skin. She quickly assembled the .416, locking the pins into place. It was a heavy, unwieldy weapon for close-quarters combat. a 50-inch spear in a telephone booth, but she wasn't going to leave it behind. She grabbed 2 heavy 5-round magazines of the .416 armor-piercing ammunition. Hayes grabbed a short-barreled M4 and a chest rig, tossing another rig to her. She slipped it over her head, securing the Velcro over her t-shirt. It was awkward without plates, but it held the ammo. TOC is 300 yards east, Hayes said, chambering around in his M4. The metallic clack was loud in the small room. If they have breaching charges, Keller is trapped in a fishbowl. He has 10 support staff in there and no heavy weapons. Then we take the high ground, she said, slinging the heavy sniper rifle over her back. The strap bit into her burned shoulder, but the pain just felt like fuel now. Roof of the mess hall. It overlooks the TOC entrance. Hayes nodded. They stepped back out into the smoke. They weren't ghosts anymore. They were the executioners, climbing the aluminum maintenance ladder to the roof of the mess hall with a bleeding heel and 30 pounds of gear took everything she had left. Her muscles screamed, flushed with lactic acid and exhaustion. Every rung felt like climbing a razor blade. Riley rolled over the parapet wall and hit the flat, tar-papered roof. The smell of hot tar and cordite was overpowering. "Set up," she breathed. She crawled to the eastern edge of the roof. Down below, 80 yards away, was the Tactical Operations Center. It was a reinforced concrete bunker surrounded by HESCO barriers. A black, up-armored SUV had crashed through the outer gate and was parked at an angle directly in front of the TOC's heavy steel blast door. 2 men were planting shaped C4 charges on the door hinges. But that wasn't the immediate problem. The problem was the heavy PKM machine gun mounted in the back of the SUV. The gunner was laying down a relentless, punishing wall of suppressive fire against the TOC's narrow observation slits. Concrete dusted into the air under the sheer volume of the 7.62 rounds. The support staff inside couldn't even return fire. They were pinned, waiting to be breached and slaughtered. 80 yards, Hayes whispered, sliding in next to her with his M4. He didn't have a shot. His 5.56 rounds would bounce off the ballistic glass of the SUV's turret shield. She unslung the .416. She didn't bother with the bipod. She rested the heavy carbon fiber barrel directly on the concrete parapet wall. "He's behind armored glass," Hayes noted, his voice tight. "Your armor-piercing rounds might penetrate, but the deflection will throw the trajectory off. You can't guarantee a kill shot through that shield." She stared through the optic. The magnification was way too high for this range. The gunner filled the entire scope, a blurry, chaotic mass of muzzle flashes and brass ejecting into the night air. "I'm not shooting the glass," she said. Her voice was dead calm. The math was returning, the geometry of violence. "What are you looking at?" "The engine block," she replied. She dialed the magnification down as far as it would go. She shifted the crosshairs off the gunner, dragging them down the hood of the SUV. "The .416 fires a 400-grain solid brass bullet," she muttered, more to herself than to Hayes. "At 80 yards, it's carrying over 8,000 foot-pounds of energy. It'll punch through the hood, shatter the engine block, and the spalling will turn the entire cab into a blender." "You're shooting through the car to hit the man," Hayes clarified. Yes, she didn't need wind calls. She didn't need thermal drop charts. This was brute force physics, point blank for a rifle designed to kill at 2 miles. She settled her cheek against the stock. She focused her breathing. The chaotic noise of the firefight faded into the background. She felt the familiar, cold stillness wash over her, the gap between heartbeats. She placed the crosshairs directly over the center of the SUV's hood, angling slightly upward towards the cab. She pulled the trigger. The muzzle brake erupted, blinding her for a split second. The concussive wave off the concrete parapet physically pushed her head back. Down below, the heavy bullet struck the SUV. It didn't make a clean hole. It hit the engine block with a catastrophic, metallic crack that sounded like a bank vault door slamming shut. The front axle of the heavy vehicle physically buckled under the kinetic transfer of energy. Steam and black smoke instantly exploded from the grille. Inside the cab, the armor-piercing core fragmented after chewing through the cast-iron engine block. The gunner in the turret simply vanished, dropping down into the cab as if the floor had fallen out from beneath him. The PKM machine gun fell silent, the barrel smoking in the cold air. She worked the bolt, ejecting the casing, and chambered a second round. The two men planting the C4 on the door froze. They looked back at the ruined SUV, confusion radiating from their posture. They had no idea where the shot came from. At 80 yards, the muzzle blast of a .416 is indistinguishable from an explosive charge. "Targets in the open," Hayes said, lifting his M4. "Take the left," she said. She put the crosshairs on the man on the right. No wind, no drop, just point and click. She fired. The bullet hit him square in the center of his chest plate. The armor didn't matter. The kinetic energy shattered every rib in his ribcage, throwing his body backward into the dirt with a violent, final thud. Hayes fired a split second later, a 3-round burst from his M4 that dropped the second man instantly. Silence fell over the TOC courtyard. Riley didn't move. She kept the scope trained on the burning SUV, waiting for movement. Her shoulder throbbed with a sickening, deep-tissue ache. Her burnt forearm was weeping fluid into the fabric of her chest rig. She was running on total sensory depletion. "Clear," Hayes finally whispered, lowering his rifle. He looked at her. His face was smeared with soot and dirt, his eyes hollow. They climbed down the ladder. It was agonizingly slow. When her boots hit the dirt, her knees buckled. She caught herself against the wall of the mess hall, breathing in heavy, ragged gasps. They walked to the TOC door. The C4 charges were still taped to the hinges, unprimed. She kicked the heavy steel door 3 times with her left foot. "Keller, open the door!" she yelled. Her voice was hoarse, cracking. A minute later, the locking mechanism cycled, and the heavy door pulled inward. Commander Keller stood there. He was holding a 9mm pistol in a 2-handed grip, his hands visibly shaking. He looked past them, staring at the ruined SUV and the 3 dead bodies in the courtyard. He looked back at her. His perfectly pressed uniform was stained with sweat. He looked small. He looked like an administrator who had just realized that spreadsheets don't stop bullets. Is it clear?" Keller asked, his voice trembling. "The courtyard is secure," she said flatly, slinging the heavy rifle over her back. She didn't salute. She didn't stand at attention. She just stared at him. "Call the QRF. Have them sweep the perimeter. Volkov's team is broken." Keller swallowed hard, lowering his pistol. He looked at the blood on her hands, the dirt caked into her face, the heavy .416 slung over her shoulder. He finally understood the monster he had ordered to stand down. "Chief Mercer," Keller started, trying to find his authoritative tone. It failed completely. I'll need a full report on this." She felt a cold, bitter smile tug at the corner of her cracked lips. She stepped closer to him, close enough that he could smell the copper blood drying on her skin. "I'll file it by 800, sir," she whispered. "Just like you asked." She turned her back on him and walked out into the smoke. Hayes fell in right beside her. They didn't talk, There was nothing left to say. They had killed the targets. They had survived the reprisal. The math was complete. But as the sirens finally began to wail across the burning compound, cutting through the freezing desert night, she tasted the copper in her mouth again. The blood and the failure. The deep, heavy realization that they had just cut off the head of the snake. And tomorrow, 2 more would grow back in its place. The distance didn't matter. 3,000 yards or 80 yards. The violence always comes home to roost. A person just has to decide if they're going to be the one holding the rifle when it does. If you felt the adrenaline spike when that generator died, do me a favor. Hit that like button to let the algorithm know you want more gritty, realistic military narratives. Drop a comment below. What was the craziest risk you've ever had to take when the plan fell apart? Share this video with someone who appreciates the raw truth of tactical survival, and make sure you subscribe to the channel. We're dropping heavy-hitting, immersive stories like this every single week. Stay sharp, stay dangerous, and I'll see you in the next operation.